The torches cast long, wavering shadows across the marble floor as she walked barefoot toward the wooden figure in the corner. Her hands trembled. Behind her stood 7 silent witnesses, their faces lit by lamplight, their eyes tracking her every movement. They had told her this was tradition, that every bride before her had done it, that refusing would bring shame upon her family. But no one had explained what the tradition actually involved. Not until now. Not until the cloth was pulled away and she saw what waited beneath it. It was the year 89 CE, during the reign of Emperor Domitian, and 18-year-old Flavia Tirsa was about to learn that Roman marriage was nothing like the saffron veil and tossed walnuts of the public ceremony. What happened behind closed doors, in a room filled with witnesses who might one day testify in court, was something altogether different. Something even Rome's own historians later struggled to put into words, something the Christian church would spend centuries trying to erase. Before we go further into this story, I'm genuinely curious where you're listening from. It constantly amazes me that a ritual from 2 millennia ago can reach people across the world today. Tell me in the comments, where are you right now? The wedding procession itself had been beautiful in its way. Flavia wore the traditional flame-colored veil, marking her as a bride. Her hair was arranged in 6 braids, bound with wool ribbons just as tradition required. The sacrifice at the temple had gone smoothly, the sheep's entrails revealing good omens. Her father had signed the contracts that transferred her from his authority to her husband's, using the ancient legal formula that made the union binding under Roman law. She had spoken the ritual words countless brides before her had recited, Ubi tu Gaius, ego Gaia. Where you are, Gaius, I am Gaia. It meant she was no longer herself. She now belonged to her husband, Marcus Petronius Rufus, a grain merchant 25 years older than she was, a man she had met only 3 times before this day. But that ceremony was only the legal beginning. What awaited her at the end of the torchlit walk through Rome's streets, inside the house she had never entered, in a room where witnesses were already assembled, was where the true transformation would take place. That was where she would learn what Roman law demanded of a wife's body. Crowds lining the procession had sung obscene verses, as was customary. The Fescennine songs were vulgar and explicit, describing in detail what would happen to her that night. Young men shouted suggestions that made her face burn beneath her veil. Her mother had once said the songs were meant to scare off evil spirits through laughter and shame. But Flavia couldn't help noticing that her mother had not laughed. Her mother had cried that morning while arranging her hair, and her final whispered warning still echoed in Flavia's mind. Do not resist. Whatever they require, do not resist. Resisting only makes it worse. They arrived at Marcus Petronius Rufus's home just as the sun vanished. The doorway was decorated with wool and greenery, the 2 torches marking it as the place where the marriage would be consummated according to law. The crowd grew louder, the songs more explicit. Someone hurled walnuts at her, meant as a fertility blessing, but to Flavia, it felt more like mockery. Her husband stood waiting in the doorway, and behind him, she could see shapes moving in the lamplight. Too many shapes for what should have been a private moment between bride and groom. Marcus lifted her over the threshold, both to prevent bad luck and to reenact something far older, from a time when brides were carried into their husbands' homes whether they wished to enter or not. Once the door shut behind her, the noise of the street faded, and Flavia saw what had been prepared in the atrium. An elderly woman in formal robes, the pronuba, whose duty was to supervise everything that would happen. A priest of uncertain affiliation. 3 female slaves with basins and cloths. An older man seated beside a leather bag full of medical tools. And in the corner, draped in heavy fabric, a wooden structure nearly 4 feet tall. The pronuba stepped forward and took Flavia's hands in a grip firm enough to restrain her, as though she expected the girl to run. Welcome to your husband's home, she said. The sacred rites must now be completed. Here lies the part almost no one ever explains about Roman marriage. It was not primarily about love or companionship. It was a property transfer, overseen, documented, and witnessed much like the sale of a farm or a ship. Roman law defined marriage as conventio in manum, literally, coming into the hand, meaning a woman passed from her father's ownership into her husband's. Before the late Republic, this transfer had been absolute. A husband held the same legal authority over his wife as he held over his slaves, including, at least in theory, the power of life and death. By the imperial era, when Flavia walked that torchlit path, the rules had softened. Women could own property. Divorce was sometimes possible, but the underlying principle remained unchanged. Marriage moved a woman from one man's control to another's. And like any major transfer of property in Rome, it required verification. Think of how Romans handled the sale of land. Witnesses observed the exchange, the property was inspected, rituals invoked divine blessing, boundaries were walked, contracts were sealed, and everyone involved understood precisely what was being transferred. The Romans applied the same logic to marriage as they did to property, with one crucial addition. The bride's primary value was her ability to produce legitimate heirs. Her body was treated as property, her fertility as a resource being exchanged, and Roman law required that both be verified before the union could be considered complete. This was not a matter of interpretation. Roman legal texts are explicit. A marriage was not valid until it had been consummated. Witnesses had to confirm the consummation. Otherwise, how could anyone know it had actually happened? The bride's virginity had to be verified, or how could the husband be certain that any children she bore would truly be his? Each of these requirements gave rise to corresponding rituals. These rituals made perfect sense within the logic of Roman law, but they are shocking to modern sensibilities precisely because that logic is so alien to our understanding of marriage today. The pronuba guided Flavia towards the draped figure in the corner. Her heart pounded so loudly, she could hear it in her ears. The pronuba's hand remained firmly on her arm, guiding her forward, allowing no escape. "You must greet Mutinus Tutinus," the pronuba instructed. "Ask his blessing before your husband approaches. You must offer yourself as tradition requires." With trembling hands, Flavia pulled back the cloth. Beneath it stood a wooden figure, carved with anatomical precision into the shape of a phallus. This was no small amulet or garden scarecrow. It was intentionally sized and proportioned for a specific purpose, a purpose that became horrifyingly clear as the pronuba explained what Flavia must do. Mutinus Tutinus was Rome's deity of fertility and sexual initiation. We know of him because multiple ancient sources mention him, always briefly and always with visible discomfort. St. Augustine, writing in the 5th century as Christianity took hold in Rome, described the practice with outrage. Roman brides were required to sit upon the wooden phallus of Mutinus Tutinus as a sacred duty before consummating their marriage with their husbands. This ritual was performed in front of witnesses. Augustine was hostile, but his description matches fragments from earlier, non-Christian texts. Lactantius called the practice so shameful that merely naming it defiled the speaker, while Arnobius provided a detailed account of brides straddling the deity's emblem as their new husbands looked on. Even Varro, writing centuries earlier with no Christian agenda, mentioned Mutinus Tutinus in language implying physical contact. Modern historians often downplay this ritual, suggesting the bride merely touched or sat briefly on the statue in a symbolic gesture. But the original sources do not support such a sanitized interpretation. Augustine used the word insidiare, meaning to settle onto or mount. Arnobius's language implied penetration. Lactantius's refusal to describe it in detail indicates that this was far more than a casual act. The stated purpose was divine blessing for fertility, but the practical purpose was preparation, breaking down resistance before consummation, demonstrating total submission before witnesses, conditioning the bride for what would follow. Flavia stood before the figure, guided by the pronuba, instructed step by step. The witnesses watched, her husband watched, and the physician waited to perform his examination afterward. Only now did Flavia understand what her mother's tears had meant, what the obscene songs had been preparing her for, and what it truly meant to be a Roman wife. She could have refused, but refusal would bring disgrace upon her family. Refusal meant nullifying the marriage contracts, returning to her father's house as a damaged woman, unfit for marriage, proving all she had been taught about duty and honor false, and declaring herself worthless. She did not refuse. After the ritual with the statue, slaves washed her in scented water. This washing had religious significance, purifying her after the encounter with the god, but it also served practical purposes, preparing her for the medical examination that followed. The physician, who had remained silent until now, approached. This examination was not optional. Before any Roman wedding involving significant property, the bride underwent verification by a physician or midwife to confirm her virginity. The results were documented, forming part of the legal record that established the bride's value. Roman medical texts describe the techniques in clinical detail, leaving no ambiguity. This first examination established her baseline, confirming she had never belonged to another man. After the ritual with mutinous tutinous, the physician conducted a second examination. This confirmed that the ritual had been performed correctly, that her physical state matched the earlier assessment, and that she was prepared for consummation with her husband. All of this occurred in the presence of witnesses, whose testimony could later be required if the marriage were ever legally contested. What strikes modern readers about Roman accounts is not only their invasiveness, but also their casualness. The Romans did not see these rituals as shocking or traumatic. They were simply necessary procedures to complete an important legal transaction. The bride's feelings, about being examined, observed, and documented, were irrelevant, no more significant than the feelings of a farm being surveyed before its sale. Property does not have feelings. Property is transferred according to established procedures. After the medical examination, Flavia was led to the bedchamber prepared for consummation. The room had been decorated according to tradition, with the marriage bed positioned so it could be observed from the doorway, which remained open throughout the night. Oil lamps provided enough light for the pronuba to watch from her position near the entrance, while the slaves who would be needed afterward waited in the corridor. Marcus entered. Surprisingly, he seemed nervous. Flavia had expected him to be confident and commanding. Instead, he glanced towards the pronuba, as if embarrassed, before approaching the bed. The pronuba spoke formally, in ritualistic tones. "The bride is prepared. The gods have blessed this union. Let the marriage be consummated according to the laws of Rome and the customs of our ancestors. Let witnesses verify its completion. Let no one question that this woman has become a wife." What followed took several hours. The pronuba observed closely, giving instructions when necessary to ensure the consummation met legal requirements. The door remained open, and the psalms of the ceremony carried into the corridor, where slaves waited. Everything that occurred in that bed was semi-public, part of a verification ritual designed to ensure that no aspect of the property transfer could later be disputed. Afterward, the physician returned for a final examination. This confirmed that consummation had occurred, marking Flavia's physical transition from virgin to wife. The results were documented, and the pronuba gave formal testimony about what she had witnessed. The legal transformation was complete. Flavia Tertia was now a Roman wife. Over the next decade, she would bear 4 children, manage her husband's household competently, attend festivals, and fulfill all the duties expected of a matron of her status. And she would never speak of her wedding night, not even to her own daughters when their marriages were arranged. What was there to say? It was tradition. It was how things had always been done. It was what being a Roman wife required. Her silence was not unusual, it was universal. Roman women did not write about their wedding nights, and Roman men did not describe what they witnessed. The rituals were so deeply embedded in daily life that speaking of them seemed unnecessary, like explaining the act of breathing. Everyone knew, no one spoke. This is why reconstructing these practices today requires piecing together fragments from hostile Christian sources, obscure legal texts, embarrassed medical manuals, and archaeological evidence. The silence was not a conspiracy. It reflected how ingrained these practices were. They were the water in which Roman women swam, so omnipresent that describing them seemed pointless. For over 1,000 years, marriage in Rome operated within this framework. Generations of women experienced their wedding nights through the same lens, passed their knowledge quietly to their daughters, preparing the next generation. The system perpetuated itself because everyone accepted its fundamental logic. Property must be verified, transfers must be witnessed, marriage created legal obligations, and women were the medium through which families continued. Internally, the logic was consistent. Externally, it seems monstrous to us today. The end did not come from internal reform, but from external conquest, Christianity transforming Rome in the 4th and 5th centuries. If women had souls equal to men, they could no longer be treated as property to be examined. If marriage was sacred, it could not include rituals the church deemed obscene. If modesty and privacy were virtues, the whole system of witnesses and verification became offensive. The transition took centuries and was never fully complete. But in cities and among educated classes, the old practices were systematically suppressed and evidence was destroyed. Statues of mutinous Teutonus were smashed or buried. Texts describing wedding night rituals were removed or left to decay. Wall paintings depicting traditional scenes were whitewashed. The role of the pronuba was reduced to a purely ceremonial one. Within a few generations, detailed knowledge of what Roman weddings had truly involved was lost, surviving only in fragmentary sources. The Christians who transformed Rome were not merely erasing embarrassing history. They were building a new civilization on Roman foundations while denying what those foundations had actually supported. They succeeded so thoroughly that most people today have no idea what Roman marriage truly entailed. The comfortable myth of saffron veils and scattered walnuts replaced the uncomfortable reality. But fragments survive. Fragments always survive. Flavia died in 131 CE at around 60 years old. She had lived as a wife for more than 40 years. What did she think about her wedding night over all those decades? Did she carry it as trauma? Did she accept it as normal? Was it something in between? Did she hope for something different for her daughters? Or did she believe that this was simply the way life worked? We cannot know. She left behind no writings. Women of her social class rarely did. The silence surrounding these rituals is the silence of women whose experiences were not considered worth recording, whose feelings about their own bodies were irrelevant to the histories and legal texts written by men. We know what happened to them. We do not know what they thought about what happened. But we know enough to understand why this part of Roman life later vanished from view. It revealed something deeply uncomfortable about the civilization we inherited. Rome is often idealized as the foundation of Western law, culture, and order. Confronting the reality of what Rome actually demanded of its women complicates that inheritance. It shows that civilization and cruelty can exist side by side, that legal sophistication can coexist with systematic dehumanization. The wedding night rituals themselves are long gone, but the women who endured them were very real. Flavia Tertia, her mother before her daughters after her, and countless generations of Roman women whose wedding nights were ceremonies of verification and control. They lived through it, they endured it, and they were silenced.